Hello, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. This is going to be episode 4, I think, in our series. Just to recap where we've come so far, we have built a couple of node groups that include diffuse lighting and a shadow mask, and you can see these two groups at work here with an input color inside of our scene. And again, this is generated using the diffuse texture that we created from this equirectangular environment that we're in. And also we went on from here to use the reflection texture in the last tutorial, and we generated a node group like this that's made up of reflection textures and the diffuse texture. And if you recall, inside of this node group we have a number of controls where we can change the roughness of the reflection. It also has a Fresnel effect, so that the portions of the reflection that are more oblique to our point of view have a higher reflectivity whenever we want to map that. So we can set this at varying degrees of reflectivity, and also as the roughness increases on our reflectivity in our node group, it adds a shadow, because as the mirror becomes more rough, it would then take on the properties of absorbing a shadow or taking on a shadow from other objects in the scene, as opposed to a perfectly clear mirror surface which would not accept a shadow. I also, in the interim, made a duplicate of that node group that does not have the shadow in it. If I click into this, you'll see this node group is the same reflection node group, but it does not have the shadow matte in it. And the reason why I did that is because I separated my diffuse lighting and my shadow mask down here, so it seemed I should make a reflective matte that does not have the shadow option in it, in case you have an overcast kind of scene and you're not using any OpenGL light. So I did make that node group as well. Just a quick note on this: as we go forward, we're not going to be very specific about making too many more node groups. I think from here we've covered a lot of the essential quick and easy steps that you can take in the formulation of a material library. And the idea is, going forward, that we would use these node groups that we have made, these few simple ones, and then develop a material library from here. And perhaps at the end of the series or near the end of it, we'll spend a tutorial just whipping together a number of materials for a material library. If that's successful, perhaps I can share the final blend file on BlendSwap for download. So that's, I suppose, what we're looking forward to in the end, is the development of a library of materials using kind of plug and play diffuse and reflective textures using that box map environment mapping that's now available to us. So we've covered reflectivity. I also made a node group in here since the last time called reflection color. For example, I'll take this reflectivity group node and then put it through my reflection color group node, and then I'll drop that into the output, and I'll show you what's going on in here. This is a very, very simple group setup. It has a saturation, hue and saturation node, which is something we talked about in the last tutorial, and then also a curves adjustment. And the idea here is that we are able to desaturate and then change the color curves in order to add a coloration to our reflectivity. I talked a little bit in the last tutorial about how, when using a diffuse texture, you want to begin with an input color and then apply the environment diffuse shading to that to make it look proper. However, when dealing with reflectivity, we are actually already beginning with the world environment colors. That is the reflection itself. So it's a lot easier, in order to generate a color, to think a little bit in reverse, that we're going to colorize our reflectivity in order to get a final result. So you can desaturate it to give a little bit more impact in your coloration, or you can keep the saturation up particularly if you're using more of the rough kind of reflectivity that can make for a very interesting effect. So that brings us to where we're at right now with the creation of this reflection color node. A very simple idea there. I want to quickly talk about specularity. And specularity is something that kind of sits apart from reflectivity. In order for this to be, I suppose, more like a paint kind of color rather than a reflective mirror, we would need to have specular highlights. Now, in order to generate specularity, we can do a couple of things here. Let me jump into this node that I've created, and I'm not going to go through the formation of this node. I'm just going to walk you through what's in here. Let's see if I can separate it out so it's a little bit easier to see. And why don't I put an input color just for the sake of viewing here? Actually, we don't need to do that. All this node is the specular highlight node. Why don't I show you what it looks like applied. So if this is in the chain after the reflection color, and we drop this in, you'll see these are the specular highlights. So it's adding white highlights in the places where the highest contrast of light would be coming from in the scene. Now, this is different very quickly from using an OpenGL light material specularity, because we want all of our highlights to be generated from the environment texture. We don't want to use our OpenGL light to generate the specular highlight. We want all of that to be generated just from the environment texture. So you can see why I used on my shadow mask just a very generic kind of material. I didn't change the hardness on it. I kept it kind of at a medium level, and we turned off the specularity. That's because the OpenGL light that's functioning as a mask, it shouldn't really exist inside of the scene. It's just being used to generate a shadow matte for our textures. That light is not real. The real light in our scene is this sun over here, and then any other reflective surfaces that are shining highlights back onto our material. That's the real lighting in the scene. So we want our specularity to be generated from that. Now, this is fairly simple, this process. All we need to do is bring in, you could do it the really simple way and just bring in the reflective material to start with. So this is our reflection. And then add to this a desaturation node. So we're going to desaturate it completely because we just want to end up with the white highlights. So we'll completely desaturate it. There's a desaturation node here. And then we're going to add a very high contrast curve and try to isolate just the very fine white areas. And we end up with something like this. So this is part of our specular highlight. Now, I tried to make this a little bit more authentic. Specular highlights have a bit of a fall off to them. So what I did is I applied the exact same scenario to the diffuse texture. So I have my diffuse texture down here. I applied a desaturation to that, so it's at 0. Then I applied a high contrast curve. And it gets me a little bit of this soft glow. Not a lot of it, but just a little bit of a very light gray. And then all I did is I added these together, full value, into this node here. So they're added together, and we end up with something that looks like that. And this starts to imply a hard surface that in such a way that our shadow mask OpenGL light would not do. The specular matte can do. It will give us that hard surface look. And then all I did is I have coming in from my group input, which would be whatever image is coming into this node, comes over here to an add node into the top slot, and then all of this gets added onto that full value. So we end up with this. Okay, so we're just adding to it a high contrast desaturated instance of the reflective and the diffuse material together. So that is my specularity node. You can make this node and add it to your bag of tricks, to your node groups to pull from in the creation of additional materials. I want to talk a little bit about textures and using textures to generate a bump mapping or a kind of a normal mapping scenario where we have bumps on our textures and surfaces. Right now we've been dealing with hard surfaces. Now there's a good side and a bad side of this. The good side is that we can do it. The unfortunate side is that we have to apply our texture in any place, any material that is being used in our final material. So if we want a bump map to be applied to our final output, we have to apply the bump map to the reflection material, to the diffuse material, and to the shadow mask at least. If we're using this Fresnel effect, we probably need to apply it to the Fresnel map as well. So these four different things here we would need to apply it to. We can do kind of a hybrid. Before we look at that final solution, I want to show you a bit of an idea that I promised we would look at in the last tutorial, and that is the idea of flakes, such as in the case of car paint. So I just want to show you a material that I made. I made this material here. It's an instance of the reflection, so I just duplicated it and then I made it its own user. And then in the texture slots, I moved down the reflection. Now this is the original reflection, so if I change the reflection texture for my environment, it should update in this material as well as all the others. So you want to be careful about your instances, how things are being used in multiple places. I want to leave this reflection texture the same in everything, so that if I want to change my environment, all I have to do is change one texture and it updates for everything. But I moved it down and then I applied this noise texture right here. So I have a noise texture. If you'll give me a moment, let me open that up here. The noise texture I generated from a plane in Blender, in the Blender internal, and I just put a procedural noise texture on it, and I just rendered out one frame at 720 by 720. So this is my noise. This is something I've done in other tutorials before, generated textures for mapping from the Blender capabilities, so from the internal render engine. So I just made a noise texture, a square one, and then I mapped it onto the reflection material, this secondary instance, and I called it reflection rough. And I set it underneath the reflection with the color turned off, not that it would matter because it's underneath, and I set the geometry normal to 1. I also turned up the size so that it's duplicated on the X and Y axis, just to make it more of a finer rough in texture. And you can see what this looks like, this material just by itself, if I add it in here. In fact, I'll show it to you right from here. If I'll do this first. Let me add the material in. You can see what this looks like. So reflection rough. The final output would be this. So it's very interesting. It looks kind of like sparkles. You have high reflectivity. Now the further I move away from it, the more you can see the reflection in it. The closer I get, the more it looks like kind of these flecks all over it. It's like it's been covered in glitter. This is the desired effect here. So if I turn down the bump map or I increase the size of the texture, you'll start to see a little bit more of a rough mirror kind of reflection. In fact, let's do that very quickly. If I come over here to my texture slot and I decrease the geometry to, say, 0.1, much less, you'll start to see the reflectivity show up a little bit more. If I take it down even further, 0.01, we'll see a little bit of a bumpy texture on this. This is another way to generate a roughened mirror. You can do it this way as well. So it's still a high gloss mirror, but it's as if it's got kind of a dimpling or a stippling going on in there. It's a kind of a rough texture rather than a brushed texture. So like hammered metal or something like that. Anyway, let me put this back to normal. We're going to use this to generate flakes as if to make car paint. Okay, and I'll show you how this works. So car paint is a subsurface material, and that the fleck is actually underneath a clear coat, and the clear coat gets the specular highlight. So it's a smooth surface, yet there is this kind of subsurface reflection going on in there. So what I did, we'll get rid of this here, is I made this node called Metallic Flakes. And this has the GL light applied to it. All this is it's a duplicate of my reflection node. So if we go into this, you'll see how this is put together. It has everything that the reflection node has, including the controls for reflectivity. Now I have the Fresnel map here set to diffuse on full. So the diffuse texture is full, and then my mirrored texture is kind of at a neutral gray. So I have in here mixed in, if we just look at this output, let me take off the fleck here for a moment. If we just look at this output, this is what the reflective material looks like. Okay. Now if we apply to it this roughened reflective material, and this is just to the diffuse side of it, that would be the part that we see here right in the middle, not the exterior side, not the high gloss side, just the diffuse side. If we apply to that with a high contrast curve, so this is the curve that I put onto it, see the colors really pop out in there. We get a very high reds and blues and yellows and greens and all kinds of colors in there. If I apply that just to this texture, and I use an add node, and I have the add set to 0.5, so it's adding just a little bit, and we get this kind of an output. So you see that we start to get kind of this colory fleck going on in there, as if it's a car paint kind of fleck in there. Okay. And then what I did is I applied the shadow mask to it, because this is a roughened kind of texture. It would cast shadow on it. We'll see what that looks like. See, on car paint, the glossiness again comes from the clear coat on the top. It doesn't come from the paint itself. So this is what we end up with. So there is shadow cast on it, which is how it would be. And then what I did is I brought this final input into the mix node with my Fresnel effect, applying the high gloss mirror up here. Okay, so this output looks like this. I think I did that right. Yep. So this is my final gloss output. So you see on the oblique areas, from our perspective, we still get that mirror gloss. It is mixed in, remember, a little bit, because I have the color at a neutral gray, so we still see some fleck. But on the outside edges, we see more of that glossy color. Okay, it's starting to look like a clear coat finish. And then on the normal parts facing us, we see this kind of flake going in there. Now it has a smooth surface on it because the flake is being applied mixed with this diffuse texture and the high gloss texture on the top. You see this noise is not affecting my diffuse or my mirror texture. It's just affecting this flake overlay that I'm putting on there. Okay, so that's the final output. I then run this through my color, my reflection color node, to give me the red colors. So now you see we have that flake in there, that fleck happening, and we see the red color that we've adjusted using our curves adjustment in the reflection color node. And then I bring this into the specularity, and we should get the final car paint kind of look. So that's the final finish. So it's a showroom, high gloss, waxed looking car paint. Okay, so all I need to do, if I want to make this look a little different, I can change my colors a little bit. So for example, let's say I want to make it more of a blue kind of color. So muscle car blue, we'll bring the blues up here, and we'll bring the reds down here. So we get kind of this Chevelle blue looking paint fleck in there. Okay, if I want to decrease the color influence of this paint fleck, all I need to do is go into my, I could do a couple things. I could reduce all of the color to this by adding a desaturation node out here, or I could just desaturate the color in the reflection color a little bit. But if I want to go directly just to that fleck, all I need to do is add a desaturation to this output before it goes into the add. So let's say we add in here very quickly a color hue saturation, and we just knock the saturation down to 0.5, just cut it in half, and you'll see that that fleck starts to stand out a lot more. So I may need to change my factor up here, but we can adjust the way that the color is interacting. I actually like it better with the color, so we'll put that back the other way. Okay. There is a style of car paint that looks a little different color and different views from your light source or from the perspective of the viewer. I invite you to look at an old tutorial that I put up using normal maps and captured materials, matte caps that explores that idea. It's a very old tutorial. If I can find it here, I'll put it into the description. Essentially, you can accomplish the exact same thing in here. All you would have to do is apply a normal mapped image. You know what? Let's just do it real quick. Why don't we just make one? So we'll go into GIMP very quickly. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a new image here. We'll make it 720 by 720, and we're just going to make kind of a rainbow appearing image here. In fact, let me see what's in the gradient. What do we have in the gradients? Yeah, nothing very good. We'll make it. We're going to take our paint bucket here. I'm going to grab a color. Let's say we do kind of a purpley color, something like that, and we'll just dump that. Whoops. Try that again. Purpley kind of color, and hit OK. We'll dump that on, and then let's go back in here and we'll do kind of a green, a contrasted color up here, and I'll go to the paintbrush. We'll go to this paint tool out here. Increase our size to kind of fill out the space. So we'll use this brush and we'll just dab on here a couple of spots, something like that. And let's do another one here. Now, this might look like total junk when we're done with it, but we'll see what we get. We'll do this blue. Again, this might be a total failure, but we'll try it. We'll put a couple spots right here. Okay, and we'll just save this out. We'll call it Funky Paint. There's a name for this. I can't remember what it's called, this kind of paint. Discard the changes. And let's quickly make a material. So we'll add another material. We'll call this material Funky Paint. And we want it to be shadeless, as all of these materials would be. And we'll add to it our image. Funky Paint. And we will set it to normal map, like that. So if we look at it, this is what we get. Yeah, good. Let's go back to our node setup here. And let's go into our GL lights, Metal Flake GL lights. And we're going to add a node. Input color, material, Funky Paint, and we will add this to our diffuse texture. And actually what we're going to do is we're going to bring in one of the nodes we've already made. So we'll bring in a group node, and we're going to bring in the diffuse lighting node. We're going to bring our funky paint into that. I believe it's the bottom color. And if you remember this node, this is the one where we are applying our diffuse texture as a matte and then an overlay. Okay, so we'll bring that in, and we're going to replace this. Let's see what happens if we put it on that curve. So you see what's happening here. As we move around, the color of the paint would change. See that? Now remember, there's a color adjustment on the outside. Okay, so as I go down here, you can see that the colors are changing on the paint. That's because this is mapped as a normal map. Yeah, this is quick and dirty, but you can see how this would work. And again, my color combination isn't probably the best, but you can see how you could accomplish some fairly interesting car paint kind of effects by doing this, generating a normal mapped color gradient with various colors. So the more oblique you get from the point of view, the more you would see these exterior outside colors in this way. So that's the idea. I might change the curve a little bit on it, so we'll maybe bring this down and darken it up a little bit. Get rid of that. So that's a little better. So you can see kind of a blue, and then some of these greens pop up, and the certain lighting in certain direction. So this is the idea here. Pretty fascinating textures you can come up with, and that paint fleck is still in there. Okay, so enough of that. Let's look at something else for a moment. One quick note is that you do need to have your object UV mapped in order to apply your textures to it. So the texture has to be applied using the UV in order for it to stick where it needs to be. Let me open up another instance of Suzanne here real quick. We'll close this one. This is a simpler discussion. Tab out of this. We'll select this Suzanne, look at the material. Fairly simple material. You can see it's got kind of a rock texture now. It's been UV mapped, but I didn't clean up any of the seams. So you can see, it's a seamless texture, but you can see the creases here where the seams are going. I did this kind of quickly. All I did is I downloaded a rock texture from textures.com, and then I made it seamless, and then I loaded it just like I did with the noise texture for the paint fleck. However, what I did, if you look at my node setup over here, my material setup, is I made special instances of everything. So first of all, I duplicated my composite node and I called it Rocky, and I made it its own instance before we changed anything. Then I went to the diffuse and I made a second instance of the diffuse texture, and I called it Diffuse Rocky, and I clicked on that to make it its own user. And then underneath here, above the diffuse, I placed my Rocky texture. It's just a black and white bump map, and it's UV mapped. And then I set my geometry to 0.2, so it's going to cause my diffuse texture to be mapped using this bump map. Then I had to do it again to the shadow mask, so I went to the OpenGL Light shadow mask. I applied my Rocky texture, and it's very important that you're using the same settings. So it's mapped at the same size with the same geometry applied to it. Okay. And then I made another texture. Because it's a black and white texture, I made another one that's, this is a shadeless texture, and it's called Rocky AO for Ambient Occlusion. And then what I did is I added the texture in, mapped the same way, and I just applied the color. And I also added the geometry. I wasn't sure if that was going to affect anything. I probably could have left that off, but I did add it anyway. But the color of the texture is applied, so I have a black and white texture. Now here's how I mapped all of this together. So I had to make a few instances that are separate. Inside of this, we'll just go to the non lit version here. So this is just the diffuse lighting. This is all the same diffuse lighting node setup that we had before, but I added one extra little piece here. I added my rocky ambient occlusion layer, and I put a high contrast curve on it, and you can see what that looks like. And then I use this to map one more time another instance of shadow. So I took my output from my diffuse texture with my shadow map applied from the diffuse texture, and then I added another darkened instance of it. So this is the output from the diffuse mapping. Okay, remember that rocky texture is applied to the diffuse texture, so it's going to show up in that texture. And then I made a darkened version of it, so I kind of did the same thing that I did earlier with my diffuse. And then I mapped this together, the dark and the light, and I used my ambient occlusion mat to map them. So the lighter colors are the regular diffuse texture, and the darker colors are this darkened version of the diffuse texture. So it's essentially the exact same process that I used over here on my diffuse texture. And then what I ended up with was my diffuse texture applied using the bump map, and the ambient occlusion mat applied in the places where there's kind of crevices. So you see how that works. Okay, so this is my output from just the diffuse texture. Then I went to my OpenGL light map, and I made a secondary instance of it, called it Rocky, made it its own user. And I went in here, and actually I didn't have to change anything about it. All I had to do was I needed to change my material. So instead of having the original shadow mask, I had to select shadow mask Rocky. I had to do the same thing in my diffuse mat as well. So in here I had to go in to my diffuse texture, and I had to select the secondary instance, the rocky one. So you see how this can get a little complex, but the idea is that you would start with that basic template, and then you would generate these materials from there. And once you have a node group put together, then you have a kind of a pre-developed material that you could use again somewhere else. Anyway, I have all of that put together. I run it then through this shadow mask that has that texture set as a bump map, and then I get this. Okay, so the GL light is being applied to it and is masking out the shadow from the diffuse texture plus the ambient occlusion mat, and it's a pretty good believable kind of texturing here and bump mapping using a texture, and it's still using the environment colors to generate the lighting. So this is the final output from that. So any texture or material that I would need to use in this scenario, I would need to make sure that I'm applying my bump map to it. If I wanted to make this reflective or shiny, or have a specular highlights on it, make it glossy, I would need to make sure that I applied my texture to an instance of the reflective material. And then anytime I use my nodes that have reflection, that I'm using that secondary instance. So this is how you can apply textures to your materials that we're generating here using these techniques. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. The next tutorial I think we're going to spend will be on making what I call a bogus refraction. So unfortunately I cannot seem to locate any manner by which we can remap or rotate our environment map. We can, in a manner, rotate and move and transpose the two-dimensional image of the map, but we can't kind of rotate the whole environment map. There doesn't seem to be a way to do that either through the material controls or through the node setup. So we're going to have to make kind of a bogus instance of refraction mapped on the outside of our object that looks sort of pretty close, pretty believable, but sort of like we're looking through the object. And we're going to make that in such a way that it has at least some believable Fresnel effects like a crystal kind of object would, refracted object. So we'll look at that in the next tutorial, and then thereafter we will look at various ways to generate a library of materials, and probably look at ways that we can generate object reflections within the scene by generating additional box maps. So that's where we're going from here. I hope this was useful to you, and I wish all of you happy blending.